For many of us, it takes some sort of personal tragedy to bring us face to face with the concept of God, the hereafter, and the connection to all of this available to each of us through prayer. But there is a question that always seems to be there. Does prayer really work? To be more specific, for purposes of our investigation, if you or someone you love is ill, can prayer make a difference?
The oldest cry of the human heart is, God, help me.
Since the beginning of time, people of all nations, religions, and belief systems have prayed. Why? Is there some scientific way to prove that prayer can help, even heal? In this episode of Ancient Secrets of the Bible, we'll be seeking the answer to the question that has been asked since time immemorial. Is there really power in prayer? We are about to look through the pages of the first continuous recorded history of mankind in the book we call the Holy Bible, as we continue our investigation into some of its most controversial stories and try to answer some very tough questions. Is the Bible a reliable account of miraculous interventions, of angels, apostles, and the power of prayer? Or is it just a collection of stories and myth, as some modern-day critics suggest? Both Bible skeptics and proponents from around the world have contributed to this exciting discussion. Some of these biblical revelations may shock and surprise you. From Genesis to Revelation, prayer is part of the sacred canon, and the power of prayer has been accepted as a given by the faithful. But in today's skeptical world, there are those who want more than just faith. They want scientific proof.
And there are hundreds of studies that indicate that faith has an actual medical value. The medical effect of faith is not a matter of faith, it's a matter of science.
But do we gain anything by taking the concept of faith out of the equation? Perhaps we should ask, is the power of prayer even something science should consider?
Prayer is one of the most fundamental of all human experiences, and so of course is an appropriate topic for a scientific investigation, as long as we keep in mind the limitations of scientific investigation. But it tells you nothing about, number one, how prayer has an effect, and number two, what the meaning and the purpose of prayer is in both the lives of the prayers and the prayees.
Is there some irrefutable way to find the answer to one of history's most puzzling questions? For thousands of years, people the world over have accepted the idea of prayer based simply on faith. But can it be demonstrated scientifically that such faith is justified? Are there any scientific experiments that might help us better understand the power of prayer? Or will it be our own experience that finally settles the question? In today's world, the idea that one should simply accept the notion that prayer works on faith alone, as our parents and grandparents did, seems to many people to be oddly old-fashioned. After all, don't we have machines that can determine that sort of thing? Science in many ways has become its own religion. The result is modern generations are more demanding. Conclusions are one thing, but how those conclusions are reached is quite another. We now have better tools, more sophisticated techniques, better methods for getting at the truth.
Well, I certainly wouldn't object if somebody wanted to say a prayer for me. But I'll stick with doctors until somebody proves that saying a prayer really helped with anything. I mean, with today's technology, we should be able to determine scientifically whether or not there really is power in prayer.
And there are those who are trying to do just that. But there's another question that many will ask. Is prayer even a proper subject for scientific investigation? Abraham Maslow, a 20th century scientist and psychologist whose studies and writings have created much of our modern thought, wrote, If there is any primary rule of science, it is acceptance of the obligation to acknowledge and describe all of reality, all that exists, everything. It must accept within its jurisdiction even that which it cannot understand, explain, that for which no theory exists, that which cannot be measured, predicted, controlled, or ordered. It includes all levels of knowledge and subjective experience. All levels of knowledge and subjective experience. Well, that should certainly include prayer. We do have a great deal of knowledge, or at least awareness of prayer, and it is, by any definition, a subjective experience. But should we be looking for scientific answers to what is essentially a question of faith?
Some things should be off limits to science. I know that scientists routinely tell us that we're just drifting along devoid of meaning, but issues related to the divine really do not need scientific answers. Besides, prayer does not need science to legitimize or justify it.
The experts are by no means agreed as to whether we should even investigate the power of prayer. But the investigation has been opened, and the possibilities for discovery are endless. History, ancient and modern, is filled with stories and examples of priests, rabbis, and lay persons praying for the salvation of nations, armies, and individuals. What is even more remarkable, the historic record suggests that in many cases, prayer worked. In fact, we don't have to go back very far in the record to find startling examples with almost biblical results. In 1991, United States military personnel were in the Persian Gulf preparing to go to war once again. Military chaplains continually encouraged the men to pray for the safe return of themselves and their comrades. And back home, millions of Americans were praying for their sons and daughters. According to U.S. Marine Major General Charles Krulak, the prayers of both the military and civilians were answered. General Krulak was responsible for supplying the frontal assault against the Iraqi army. The threat of chemical warfare created a critical need for an ample water supply for decontamination purposes. The general had discovered wells that could supply 100,000 gallons of water a day, but he received orders to move his base of operations 74 miles to the northwest to an area called the Gravel Plains. Attempts to drill for water produced only dust. Experts from oil engineers to Bedouins were unable to help. The date for the ground attack was drawing near, and still no water could be found. General Krulak had met with his staff officers for morning prayers since 1977. Now the critical need for water was the focus of their prayers. One Sunday morning, shortly before the launch of the ground attack, a colonel abruptly interrupted the prayer meeting. It was important, he said, that General Krulak come with him immediately. The colonel took General Krulak down a road that had recently been constructed by the Marine Corps. What the general saw jumped out like a mirage in the desert. A pipe stuck out of the ground not 50 yards from the new road, and at the base of the pipe was a green diesel generator, a red pump, and a 1,000-gallon fuel tank filled with a type of diesel fuel the general says was not in use by the Allied forces. When General Krulak pushed the ignition button, the generator started up instantly. The flow of water from the well was within 10 gallons of the 100,000 needed each day to protect the troops. The general and over 20,000 Marines had traveled that road, yet none of them saw the brightly painted pump until that Sunday morning. General Krulak, in an article published shortly after the end of the hostilities, is quoted as saying, "There was no way anyone could have driven down that road and not seen the well and equipment painted in multiple colors. That well was the result of the prayers of righteous men and women." There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of stories all related to prayer that come from our military history. But so far they all appear to be anecdotal. Is there any real evidence that anyone from the poorest peasant to the grandest potentate can in fact change anyone's fate through the simple act of prayer? If the question is, can the effects of prayer be demonstrated empirically to everyone's satisfaction, the answer is no, probably not. And the reason is partly due to the nature of prayer itself. There's a popular song that goes a long way toward explaining that. The title is, "Some of God's Greatest Gifts Are Unanswered Prayers." Prayer, by its very nature, is intensely personal.
Prayer is talking to God. One of the most important things we believe about God is that He's personal, that He's not a force, He's not this impersonal cosmic concept. He is a personal God who has created persons who are able to relate to Him personally. And prayer is one of the fundamental ways we exhibit that we're made in God's image and are able to relate to Him by talking to Him through prayer. And so prayer has a lot of components to it, but it's fundamentally talking to God, who loves us and cares for us and hears our prayer as a father hears the prayers of a child. So I think the first thing to realize is that prayer is not some rote thing we do. It needs to be done with engaged hearts. One of the most powerful passages in the Bible is when it says that Jesus prayed, not sort of as a detached rote thing, but with cries of anguish, with fervent prayer from the heart. And so we are talking to God, and so we go to Him and we cry out for Him to answer our prayers. But the reality is that He doesn't always do that. He doesn't always answer our prayers in the way we ask Him to answer them. And so in those times, as difficult as it may be, we need to be able to submit to the sovereign plan of God in our lives in a fallen world and trust Him that even when things don't go the way we hope they would, even then when they don't go the way we would expect them to from God's perspective, He still loves us, He's still at work, and we can trust Him in that.
If your prayers and my prayers were all answered to our personal satisfaction, the result would be chaos. So sometimes the answer is no, but that doesn't mean the prayer wasn't answered. On the other hand, there are studies that have been done and more that will be done designed specifically to demonstrate the effectiveness of prayer. One such study was done by Dr. Robert A. Hummer and was designed to see if prayer could affect adult mortality. The results were astonishing.
In the study, we found that religious attendance works to influence life expectancy and mortality. Researchers from the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Colorado, and Florida State University followed about 22,000 people over a 9-year period and found that people who regularly attend church or religious services once a week on average live to 82 years. People who attend more than once a week live on average to 83 years. But people who never attend live on average to only 75 years. We think something important is going on here.
All of these studies begin with a bias, and the bias tends to be a religious one, and how much the bias affects the outcome is very evident in some cases, and in other cases it's hard to tell if the observer was putting aside his biases or not.
Since religion generally and prayer specifically is such an intensely personal event, we wonder if it is possible to construct a strictly objective test of the power of prayer. For some individuals, however, the test seems to come whether they want it or not, and for them the results cannot be questioned. We've recreated one of these stories for you. The person telling the story is the person who had the experience.
She was holding our baby daughter who was crying uncontrollably and burning up with fever. My wife had tried to call the doctor, but was told he was gone for the weekend. And since we live in a rural area, it didn't appear we could get professional help before Monday morning. Terrified by the prospect of what a sustained high fever might do to one so young, I held the baby close to my breast and began rocking her gently in my arms. Her cheeks and her forehead were bright red and took on a purplish hue with each anguished cry. Without knowing why, I turned and walked down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. A door was open, and I slipped in and sat on the edge of one of the older children's beds. And from somewhere in the depths of my memory, I recalled a passage from the book of John. And whatsoever ye shall ask in my name, that will I do. I placed my hand on my daughter's burning brow and dropped my head in prayer. As I asked God to comfort and protect our baby, I felt her fever disappear. My daughter's forehead so frighteningly hot, literally turned cool beneath my hand. I felt it as surely as I felt water turn from hot to cold. And almost at the same instant, the baby stopped crying. She looked up at me in the semi-darkness, and her tiny hand reached out and touched my cheek. Then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. My wife, concerned by the sudden quiet, came in and wanted to know what was wrong. I handed her our daughter and told her nothing was wrong, with a calm assurance I'd never felt at any other time in my life. I said simply, "She'll be fine."
There are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of stories just like that, each one unique in its own way, and each brings up the question that is most often asked when it comes to prayer: can prayer heal? And once that question is asked, several more questions immediately cry out to be answered. Is prayer the instrument of healing? Or is it something in the person's mind or natural energy that brings about the healing? According to this book, healing and prayer have been the subject of scientific examination for over a century. For most physicians, the idea that prayer can produce results different than the medical expectation is sheer nonsense. But remarkably, in a recent study of 269 doctors, 99% said they were convinced that religious belief can heal. And an amazing 75% of the doctors said they believed the prayers of others can help in a patient's recovery. For Dr. Brian McMurray, every day is a real-life version of the emergency room drama seen on TV. Dr. McMurray was an attending and teaching physician at the emergency room of Vanderbilt Medical Center when this incident took place.
And 11 years ago, I saw this horrible fatal illness and infection overwhelm a healthy young 18-year-old girl and take her life. And this horrible infection called fulminant meningococcemia just overwhelmed her and killed her. And I was her physician, and nothing I could do would make a difference. And I saw, 11 years later, another young girl dying in front of me of the same illness. And we saw her in the emergency department, admitted her to the hospital, and I knew she was going to die. She had all the same markers and signs and symptoms. And I prayed, and we went to the Sunday Bible study group, and we all prayed. The whole group prayed for this young girl. And 4 days later, she awakened, and over the course of about 24 hours, was able to come off life support, and 3 days later was discharged from the hospital. And I'm telling you, there is no doubt that was a miracle. I know the medical science. I know she was dead. She had no chance. And she made it. And I look at that now as God saying to me, see what you've been missing?
Just how powerful is the evidence linking prayer and health? More than 30 studies have found a connection between spiritual commitment and longer life. And according to some sources, there have been hundreds of studies that have been done. But have there been any conclusive results?
Scientists have been trying to find evidence for prayer for well over a century now. What I've tried to do in my writings is to survey this evidence and give people a chance to look at it so they hopefully can make up their own minds about whether or not prayer works.
When people make up their minds about the evidence for prayer, they also need to keep in mind that there's a generally accepted principle in science that the more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary the required proof. And that degree of proof is simply lacking in any of the studies to date.
One way of approaching people's stories and anecdotes about whether or not prayer works is simply to bring it into the laboratory and put it to the test. Now, having said that, I don't think we need science to legitimize prayer. If we can bring science into the mix, I think we're farther ahead of the game than if we just follow along with pure faith and belief.
Early in the last half of the 20th century, one of the first attempts was made to study prayer scientifically. The experiment was implemented in 1951 at the University of Redlands in Redlands, California. The researchers were delighted. They were convinced they had witnessed total healing in prayer. That may have been true in 1951, but will it stand up to scrutiny today?
The Redlands study belongs to the first generation of prayer studies. Although I admire the researchers for their courage in tackling this very controversial area, I have to say that many of the more recent studies are far better than the Redlands study.
In recent years, there have been a number of studies on prayer and healing. I've looked at these studies, and it appears that there's been a lot of bias on the part of the researchers that favors religious healing. And when you get right down to it, the statistics aren't all that dramatic in favor of prayer having a healing effect on the individuals involved in the studies.
I've been looking for a single so-called killer study that will prove the case for prayer and just sweep away all criticism. But I don't think we're going to find that sort of study. The best evidence is when you bring all the studies together. You know, this is the way science is done. Rarely do you have one crucial study that just wipes away all controversy in science. You have to put things together. And when you look at the field of prayer studies, prayer experimentation, and you ask the question, what overall direction is this field headed in? I think you can get a very clear indication that it points toward the effectiveness of prayer. So for me, you bring all the studies together. That's where we find the compelling picture that prayer works.
In ancient times, medicine and religion were so thoroughly intertwined that the medicine man was, in many cases, also the priest. The first hospitals were founded in monasteries. Physicians of this era were usually monks, but the advent of the scientific revolution changed all that. So firmly was the church in charge of all truth that Galileo was forced to recant the things he actually saw through his telescope. Today, the reverse is true. Science appears to be the sole arbiter of truth. So much so that while many of us can describe a reasonably good scientific study, few know what constitutes acceptable prayer.
In September 1984, doctors confirmed that my wife, Mary Jean, had lymphoma cancer in her abdomen. The disease had spread to the point that she could not have removed by surgery. One morning, the question confronted me that I did not want to consider at all. It was as if God was saying, "Are you willing for me to take Mary Jean from you?" And my response in my heart was, "Of course not." But the question would not leave. It was like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he prayed, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done." I responded to God and said, "Father, I do submit to your will." A great peace came upon my heart that never did leave.
In June, when we went back to see the doctor, I had real peace in my heart. And when he held up this negative from the CAT scan and it showed just a little scar left, I knew that God had done a miracle for me.
That was 15 years ago. She's been clear ever since. The doctor himself said to us, "I've only seen about 1% of my cases who've experienced divine intervention, and I'm glad that you are part of that 1%. I believe there are 4 principles that stand out and make prayer effective. Number 1, we need to get the mind of the Spirit in the things that we ask God for. And to do this, we must surrender our wills to the Lord. Second, we must trust in the power and in the mercy of our Lord. Third, we need to give God time to do what he wants to do and to teach us the lessons that we need to learn. And fourth, we need to realize that he does not always heal. This is entirely in the realm of his mercy and his purposes.
Now that we have some idea of the power of prayer, let's look at one of the more recent studies and see if we can determine who has access to that power. In 1988, cardiologist Randolph Bird designed a study to scientifically evaluate the role of God in healing. Over a 10-month period, a computer assigned 393 patients admitted to San Francisco General's coronary care unit to either a group being prayed for by in-home prayer volunteers or to a group that was not remembered in prayer. The study was designed according to rigid criteria. It was a randomized, double-blind experiment. Neither the 192 patients in the prayed-for group nor the 201 patients in the not-remembered group knew which group they were in, nor did the attending physicians and nurses know. Byrd recruited various religious groups to pray for members of the designated group, with as many as 5 to 7 people praying for each patient. The results were most revealing. The prayed-for patients were 5 times less likely to require antibiotics and 3 times less likely to develop pulmonary edema. None of the prayed-for group required endotracheal intubation, and fewer patients in this group died. It would seem that anybody has access to the power of prayer, whether they know it or not.
These studies show this. If what was being evaluated in these studies was not prayer but a new medication, this would have been heralded as a modern medical breakthrough. And it's no exaggeration to say that people would have been lined up down the block to get their hands on this stuff.
If the studies being discussed were not about prayer but about a new drug or a new surgical procedure, that would be an entirely different story. When a supernatural claim is being made, the level of proof required is what we call extraordinary.
Pythagoras, the ancient Greek mathematician and philosopher, said that the most divine art was that of healing. And if the healing art is most divine, it must occupy itself with the soul as well as the body. Today, the literature abounds with articles, papers, and books extolling the virtues of the mind, body, and spirit connection. The importance of connecting these attributes of the human system now appears to be one of the most prominent aspects of the divine art. But can this be accomplished without prayer? Or is prayer the linchpin that holds the total human system together? Actual scientific studies are, of course, more likely to be undertaken in the controlled environment of the medical community where conditions can be carefully monitored. But if prayer can be scientifically proven to be of value in these situations, what does that tell us about the other evidence? Science requires the results of a study to be replicable in order to be valid. Does the historic evidence meet that criteria? Does the evidence of multiple witnesses establish the power of prayer? Many of the questions remain unanswered so far as the scientific community is concerned. But to the person of faith, whose experience has made him the beneficiary of that power, the whole argument is superfluous. Still, it is interesting to know that even though the scientific studies that have been done are criticized by skeptics as being flawed in various ways, none of the results suggest that prayer does not work. And perhaps that's one of the greatest of the ancient secrets of the Bible.